So we'll go ahead and get started, and as people join, hopefully they will just jump in with us. I'm very excited to have you all here today for the first webinar in a series of webinars hosted by Just Roots Consulting. I just want to take a brief moment to introduce myself since many of you may not know me. My name is Milo Primo. I use he, him pronouns or they, them pronouns. I am a civil rights attorney licensed in the state of New York, practice in upstate New York, providing assistance to people who experience discrimination in the workplace and healthcare access and education and so on. In addition to that, I'm also the founder and CEO of Just Roots Consulting, which is a firm that works with employers and organizations, and at the moment, a lot of legal services organizations to increase your capacity to do better with equity and inclusion, particularly around LGBTQ people, but other historically marginalized folks as well. So we wanted to offer this series of webinars to give you a foundation of tackling these issues in your workplaces. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are, but also to give you a taste of what it is that we do and what we're about and what we believe in. So we're excited that you're here and joining us today. I see a few more folks are wandering in, but we'll go ahead and get started for the sake of time. We only have an hour together, which is actually not too long. Just so you know, we will be using this, this platform to its fullest extent. So if you've never used Zoom before, you should be able to see my video speaking to you, as well as I'm sharing my screen with the presentation in the background. You also can use your own screens to raise your hands and be able to ask a question. So I will keep my eyes on the screen to make sure if anybody's asking questions, I can call on you and have you jump in and speak or provide responses and answers. You can also, if you don't want to actually raise your hand, you can use the Q&A prompt to ask questions that I will try to keep an eye on and answer in real time if I can, but if I can't, I will definitely follow up with you with responses after the fact. We'll also be using polling and other things. So hopefully this will go smoothly for us and technology will work in our favor. So without too much more ado, let's go ahead and jump in here. So this is the first of a series. You know, today we have an hour together to lay the groundwork with some mindful best practices and some core concepts. The goal for today is to make sure that everyone is on the same page with regard to terms and concepts involving and impacting LGBTQ individuals and communities. From here, we will take what you learned today and we'll build on it next week, next Wednesday, same time, same bat channel, to talk specifically about how employers and organizations can effectively and equitably affirm and include LGBTQ and specifically transgender people in the workplace. So this is a foundation laying session. This may be old news to some of you, it might be brand new to a lot of you. So I hope that everyone gets something from it today. But next week, we'll be getting more into the nitty gritty of what managing trans people in the workplace can look like in an equitable setting. And then after that, the third session, which is 2 weeks from today, we're going to be talking about the bottom line, which is thinking about how it is actually that inclusivity and equity in the workplace, especially around LGBTQ people, translates into a dollar amount, translates into profitability for your company, for your organization, possibly new grant opportunities for your nonprofit. And it's not just simply the right thing to do and the legal thing to do, but it also can translate into prosperity for your organization. So we're going to talk about all of those things. So in case none of these other reasons are good enough for you, that should be a good one as well. Everybody likes to succeed. So we can all do it together. All right. So without any further ado, I see we have a good number of folks here. Let's just go ahead and jump in. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is actually language. We're going to make sure that everybody's on the same page with some key concepts and core terms. What I want to say about language generally is to emphasize the importance of the power of language. You know, language is something that is ever growing, ever changing. It is incredibly dynamic. There are new words added to our language every day, and all languages every day. It's also important to recognize the power that comes with language, the power behind language. People with power, with privilege, with authority, people who have the sort of leverage and privilege to decide language, what is the correct language to use and what is incorrect, what's grammatical and what's not, exert a lot of power in a lot of different ways. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But recognizing that there are a lot of people in this world, a lot of people in our society, a lot of people in this day and age who lack the kind of power and authority that many other people do have. And to be able to create language that accurately and fully expresses our lived experiences in the world is an incredible thing. And it's not something to be taken for granted. Especially when we're talking about LGBTQ people, most of us experienced a world, grew up in a world that did not adequately describe our experiences. There weren't words to use that we could wield to explain to people and to relate to people what it is that we felt and experienced as we navigated the world. And so, like a lot of other minority cultures and marginalized cultures and people and communities, LGBTQ people have, over the years, created new words to express our experiences. And so, some of the things we're going to talk about today are words that maybe didn't exist, or at least were not being regularly used a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 5 years ago. And they may be words that are different 5 years from now, right? And so the importance is recognizing the impetus of the words, where they come from. They come from the community, and it's a powerful tool for a community to be able to describe and label itself, and to be able to explain itself and relate itself to the world. So acknowledging that source of empowerment when we're talking about these words, and also recognizing that a lot of these words can also be used for harm, and they can be misused. And so there is a lot of power behind language and in the way that we use it. I also want to say at the outset that a lot of people will shut down at the idea of being perfect about language, right? Nobody wants to make mistakes, but as far as I'm aware, we're all human, and we make mistakes all the time. And so recognizing that we make mistakes, knowing that we will never be perfect and we will never be precise, what can we do instead? I think that the goal for me, if you take nothing else away from this entire session, is to think about mindfulness. Think about how we can approach language and relating to one another, other human beings, in a way that's mindful and thoughtful and reduces harm. There's actually a quote I'm going to share with you briefly by Padraig Ó Tuama, who is a gay theologian in Ireland who is a peace worker dealing with the conflict between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And he spends a lot of time thinking about language and the power of language in that conflict and in his own life. And he has this to share with us. Language is limited because language needs courtesy to guide it, and an inclusion and a generosity that goes beyond precision and becomes something much more akin to how is it you can be more attentive to the implications of language for those in the room who may have suffered, right? So you can take a big sigh of relief. You can relax your shoulders. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to do this right all the time, but I am going to ask you to be mindful as you move forward, utilizing language in a way that's empowering and uplifting, and not in a way that's harmful. And when you find out that you have caused harm, if you've made a mistake, you can always apologize, correct yourself, and try again, right? And I think that's the big piece, is to keep trying. So, all right, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. So I'm going to introduce you to 4 key concepts. Some of you may already know these, but for those who don't, I don't want to assume where anybody is. So we're all going to start on the same page. The first one of these is birth sex. So this is a fairly self-explanatory term. It is our sex assigned at birth. So let's utilize this webinar platform, shall we? By a show of hands, can everybody lift your hand if you were at some point born? For those who were born, can you raise your hand? All right. So most people are raising their hand. That's great. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to lower all of your hands. Thank you so much. All right. So most of us were born, right? And we are a judgment-free space here. So if there are any robots on the webinar, you are welcome and accepted here. But For those of us who were born, the chances are good that there was somebody nearby who was a medical professional who took a look at our bodies and said, aha, it is a boy or it's a girl. And they slapped a correspondingly blue or pink cap on our heads, wrapped us in a blanket, and sent us off to a nursery, right? But and that gender marker, that sex assigned at birth, turns into a marker that is on our birth certificate, that gets translated onto our driver's licenses and our social security records and our medical records and our school records, and all sorts of other things, our voter registration. I mean, it ends up everywhere, right? But all it is, if we really think about it, is just someone else's observation of our bodies at birth and what it is that they saw and what they declare about it and how that ends up on our paperwork, right? So that's our sex assigned at birth. To contrast that, we have the gender identity. Gender identity is our deeply held sense of who we are, right? So this isn't somebody else's observation of our body and their perception of it and how they write it down on a piece of paper. This is who we are. This is who we know ourselves to be. Gender expression, again, to distinguish, is how we communicate that gender to the rest of the world, right? So this is the way that we move through the world, the way we carry ourselves, the intonation and inflection in our voices, the jewelry or the makeup that we wear, how we fashion our hair, what clothes we wear, what pronouns we use. And we will get to pronouns in a bit. But the idea is that we are communicating to the rest of the world how it is that we express our gender. And what's really important about this is that it is something that we learn to look for from a very young age. You know, almost as soon as we can talk, we're starting to pick up cues about whether we think someone is a boy or a girl or masculine or feminine. And sometimes at a very young age, we're very okay and comfortable with asking these questions pretty unabashedly. And I think what's really interesting to think about, we won't get into too much of that here, but just to kind of stick it in your mind to think about later, is why is it that that is so important? How is it that we've communicated that to toddlers who are just learning to speak, that this is something so essential, so important that we need to ascertain, we need to find out people's gender from a young age? How are we communicating that, and why? What is it about it that's so important? Is it the way that we're going to relate to people is different because of how we perceive their gender or how they identify themselves? And why is that significant? So just recognizing that it's very deeply embedded and indoctrinated in us from a very young age, and it's something that we all actively do, right? And then finally, I want to introduce you, of course, to sexual orientation, which is our attraction to other people, sexually, romantically, spiritually, emotionally, or lack thereof, right? So what's really important about all of these terms, though, is that when we hear about birth sex or gender identity or gender expression or sexual orientation, we attribute them, we associate them with people in the LGBTQ community, right? When we're talking about sexual orientation, we think our mind goes directly to people who might be LGBTQ, might be lesbian or gay or bisexual, right? But the truth is, every single one of us, unless you're a robot, every single one of us on this session, we're born and we all have gender identity and we all have gender expression and we all have sexual orientation, right? It just so happens that we live in a society where these things, when they line up in a certain way, we consider them to be good or ideal or normal or aspirational. We give folks with a certain lineup of these things credit and credibility and benefit of the doubt and a lot of other perks in our society, right? So let's think about these things that kind of line up in a very binary way, two options here. The first is somebody who's assigned male at birth, who identifies as man or boy, who's masculine and heterosexual or attracted to the opposite sex, assuming that there only is an opposite sex. And on the other side, of course, we have somebody who is identified as female at birth, who assigned female at birth, who identifies as a girl or a woman, is feminine and heterosexual or attracted to the opposite sex, right? But I'm here to tell you that these are not the only two sort of alignments or options that exist in the world. This might be spoiler alert, that there are other people that exist outside of this particular alignment of things, right? So, for example, in terms of sex, we have people who are intersex. Intersex people are folks who have one of many different kinds of conditions that result in atypical chromosomal, hormonal, or anatomical makeup that are not traditionally thought of as male or female, right? There are a lot of people that have intersex conditions, and sometimes this results in, a moment at birth when that medical professional takes a look at your body and says, "Oh gosh, I'm not sure if it's a boy or a girl," right? Sometimes it's somebody who hits puberty and goes through puberty that they were not expecting to go through. And sometimes it happens in adulthood when going to create a family and finding that you're unable to do so, and learning, or that there are complications, learning that it has something to do with an intersex condition you were unaware of. Historically and problematically, a lot of intersex individuals who were identified as such at birth were quote unquote fixed by the system, by the medical professionals who came across them, thinking that they needed to be made normal in order to live good and healthy and normal lives. For a very long time, these sort of corrective procedures were forced on children shortly after birth, without parental knowledge or consent, as something that just needed to be done as medically necessary, even though it was absolutely not medically necessary. After a while, parents got upset about this, as you might imagine, and there was a move toward at least advising parents that these sort of things needed to happen, and to try to get them to consent to it. But it was framed in such a way that often scared or intimidated parents into consenting. Now we have multiple generations of intersex adults who are coming out and being incredibly visible and incredibly active to shed some light onto this very harmful, sometimes devastatingly harmful practice by the medical community, to perform these sort of corrective surgeries without the individual's consent or knowledge, when they're really not medically necessary. And there's a move in the medical community, including recommendations from the American Medical Association and others, to take a hands-off approach to intersex babies and let them grow up and decide for themselves who they are. So one study suggests that, which I think is very helpful, that there are as many intersex people in our society as there are natural redheaded people, which is not to say that all natural redheads are intersex, but it is to say that if you know somebody who's a natural redhead, the chances are good that you also know somebody who is intersex. So it's fairly common, and just recognizing that there are two sexes beyond strictly male and female is pretty important. Next, thinking in terms of gender identity, there are certainly gender identities outside of the binary of man or woman, right? There are people who identify as non-binary or outside of that sort of paradigm of male or female, man or woman. Genderqueer is another term that's sometimes used interchangeably and sometimes not. It really depends on a person's own sort of definition of themselves and who they are. There's also a term called two-spirit that is an umbrella term used to describe the different kind of identities that are found in mostly North American indigenous cultures over millennia, and also in, kind of a nod to a hat tip to all the different ways that people have identified themselves in indigenous cultures around the world since the beginning of human civilization, that identify outside of the strict binary system. Historically, in other cultures, particularly in North American indigenous cultures, two-spirit people are considered uh, holy, are considered sacred and wise um, and medicinal, and people who are peacekeepers, and people who are revered, And in our culture, we don't have that same reverence to people who experience gender outside of the binary system. But that does exist, and it has always existed. Also thinking about gender expression, we have people who we might identify as being gender nonconforming, which is really just saying that somebody doesn't align to our stereotypes around sex, right? What we think of being masculine or think of being feminine in accordance to how we perceive their gender, right? So you might have somebody who is assigned male at birth who identifies as a man and is effeminate or not particularly masculine, right? Or somebody who was assigned female at birth, identifies as a woman, and is not particularly feminine. These people might be described as gender nonconforming or gender expansive, or a bunch of other words that you could use in that way. And then, of course, again, spoiler alert if you didn't know this, but there are people who have sexual orientations aside from being heterosexual or straight. There are people who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, queer, which can describe sexual orientation as well as other things. But that is to say that there are a lot of different ways that people can identify. And I don't want to get into too much detail here because we do have a lot to get through, but I do want to touch on the word queer very briefly. So queer is a word that historically was used as a weapon against people who did not live up to social expectations around gender. So people who were perceived to be gay or lesbian or not masculine enough or not feminine enough. It was a word that was used to inflict pain on people for not living up to social standards, right? So in this day and age, it is a generationally problematic term. There are certainly people who are older or more seasoned in the LGBTQ community, and also outside of the community, for whom this is an extremely painful term, and just hearing the word can be very harmful. And so recognizing that, while also holding the fact that a lot of folks in the younger generations have taken that term as a term of empowerment and use it as a way to identify themselves. For example, I identify myself as a queer transgender person. It's a word that I use very proudly, and it's something that for me is an all-encompassing term that covers the full breadth of my experience within this community in my lifetime. But I also recognize that not everybody uses that word. So just as a moment of mindfulness, thinking about being sure to use these words wisely, and recognizing that not everybody who's in the community uses that word for themselves. So later, when you go back to work after this webinar, you can say, oh my gosh, we watched this incredible session with this queer trans person, and it was just very informative and entertaining. And that would be okay, because I've told you that's how I identify. But if I didn't tell you that, it would probably be unwise to use that word willy-nilly, because you just don't know how people identify, and you don't know if you're going to cause harm inadvertently. So just a word of caution. Just make a moment to see if there are any questions. I don't see any open questions. Feel free to use it if you want to. You can certainly ask questions or raise your hand, and I will keep an eye out for both in case anybody has questions. Okay, let's move forward. So that gets us to the term transgender. So the word trans or transgender is somebody who knows that their gender identity, their deeply held sense of who they are, is significantly different from their sex assigned at birth, right? And of course, significantly different is really subjective. It's very different for each person. There's no one way to be a transgender person. There's no one way to transition. What it means for each person is different for everyone. But it's a good umbrella term to think about people who just don't enjoy that kind of alignment of gender identity and sex assigned at birth that our society thinks of so highly. That being said, I'm going to introduce you to another word, which is cisgender. This is a word that has come into more and more common use in probably the past decade or so, and I think is becoming more frequently used. And it is a word that describes people whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth do not significantly differ, right? So basically, if you were a person who does not identify as a transgender person, you could be described as, or you could identify yourself as, a cisgender person. Now, for those etymology nuts on the webinar, I'll satisfy your curiosity. So trans is the root of trans is to cross or to change, right, to move. Cis in, I think it's chemistry, refers to cis particles that are part of molecules that are the same, right? So the idea is that there's some sameness or alignment there that doesn't exist for trans people. So you might think, why is it important for us to have a word like cisgender in our language? Not only just important, but how is it helpful, right? Well, think of the alternative. So if we didn't have a word like cisgender in our language, and we wanted to talk about people, different kinds of people who might experience different things, we might be tempted to talk about transgender people and then normal people, right? In a way that talks about trans people as this sort of other group or subgroup, as not quite people, right? So there's a very strong value judgment that comes against somebody by being labeled transgender if there is not another word, another adjective in our language that describes people who are not transgender, so that we can talk about them both evenly and in the same way, right? So for example, the next time you're sitting around a table thinking about maybe a policy that you have at your organization, and you're wanting to make sure that it's up to date and that it will be equitable and affirming to everybody that it needs to connect with in some way. And you're looking at it and you're going, okay, well, how is this going to affect people of color? How is this going to affect people with disabilities? How is this going to affect people with limited English speaking language ability, right? Another question to ask would be, well, how is this going to affect transgender people differently than it might affect cisgender people, right? So it's a way of being able to talk about people and in different parts of the community and different experiences they have without placing a value judgment on those identities. And it's extraordinarily helpful. It's also a really great tool for allyship for people who are cisgender, to be able to identify themselves as cisgender to others, which kind of opens the door to a conversation for people who don't identify that way to feel a little more safe in doing so. I'm going to give you an example. So, I have been part of this community for over 20 years now. And, even today, 2 decades in, anytime I see a rainbow sticker in the corner of a window as I'm walking into a dentist office or a legal services office or a grocery store or wherever, that little symbol, even though it's a small token, that little symbol is a communication to me that someone in that building, someone in that office has thought about me and has thought about the particular needs that I might have walking in the door or my experiences walking in the door, and has wanted to communicate to me that that space is a little safe for me, right? That there's someone there who might understand me, which feels really good, okay? In the same way, if I'm talking to a group of people and I'm worried about ever having to out myself as trans or expose my trans identity because I'm afraid of experiencing discrimination or harassment or even violence, if I'm talking to a group of people and one of them identifies themselves, proactively as being a cisgender person, the fact that they took the time to do that, the fact that they, well, as a cisgender person, this is something that I do, this is my approach to something. Just hearing that is a signal to me that this is probably a safer space because this person knows enough to recognize that being a cisgender person in this world is a very different experience than being a transgender person. And that recognition means that I'm going to be a little bit safer in that space. So it's a good tool for advocacy and allyship as well. All right, checking for questions. Don't see any yet, so I'm going to keep going. All right, so this is my Milo approved list of terms that you can use safely. If ever in doubt, if there's a term that you've heard on television or on the internet and it is not on this list, maybe don't use it until you know for sure that it's okay for a person that you use it to refer to them. And of course, if a person uses a word for themselves that's not on this list, it's always okay to use that to describe them. But just be wary of other terms you might have used. These ones are safe. So the real take home here is that transgender, like the word cisgender, they're both adjectives. So they describe things. They are not nouns. They are not verbs. They are descriptors, right? So when we're talking about transgender person or people, transgender woman is someone who identifies as a woman today. Transgender man is someone who identifies as a man today. Trans or cis are perfectly acceptable short forms. Again, non-binary or genderqueer would be fine, depending on how somebody identifies. And then also gender transition, which is definitely a preferred term over things that we've used in the past, like sex change or sex reassignment, right? In thinking about people's experiences, the wholeness of their experience going through a transition process, there's so much more to it than just the medical piece. And if we're being really honest with ourselves, when we hear the term sex change or sex reassignment, our minds automatically go to surgery, and our minds specifically automatically go to surgery, probably on genitals, which, if any of you have participated in any sexual harassment prevention trainings, know it's a bad idea, right? So let's pull ourselves out of that mindset and let's think about people's full lived experiences going through gender transition, which can include so many different things, right? It may include medical pieces, but it may include a lot of other stuff too. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, I want to talk about pronouns. So pronouns are the words that we use to describe ourselves in the first person, like I, me, and my, but we also describe other people in the third person. Like some that we might be more familiar with are like the feminine pronouns she, her, hers, and herself, right? And titles like Miss or Mrs. We also have masculine pronouns like he, him, his, himself, and Mr. But we also have a bunch of gender neutral pronouns that people use who don't want to use pronouns that are associated with one definite gender of feminine or masculine, and sort of all the connotation that comes with that, right? So some of the other gender neutral pronouns that people use, among them these days, the most common in my experience, are they, them, their, and themselves, and also the gender neutral title mix or MX instead of Miss or Mr. There are a lot of other ones, though, that I wanted to introduce you to. Some of them are less common than others, but the other ones that seem to have some traction are Z and Zir or here, and then also A, M, or air, which is easy to remember if you knock off the TH from they, them, and their. You would be left with A, M, and air, which are the Spivak pronouns that are available. And I think what's really important about these is recognizing that people have used gender neutral pronouns throughout all of history, right? And in fact, you use them on a pretty regular basis, even if you don't realize that you're doing it. So for example, let's say that you're leaving a meeting and you're cleaning up and people left gum wrappers and paper and all sorts of stuff. And you notice that somebody left their cell phone and you go, oh gosh, someone left their cell phone. I hope that they find it. I hate it when I lose my cell phone, right? And there you've talked about an individual person using gender neutral third person pronouns of they or their, and you don't even really think about it, right? Because you don't know whose cell phone it is. You don't know how they identify, and you do it automatically without thinking about it. But sometimes when we're having to intentionally use gender neutral pronouns for people because those are the pronouns that they use, we get really hung up on it. There's a lack of muscle memory that we have that we can fall back on and depend on in our minds. So what I will say is that not only do you use it all the time, but also all the major dictionaries have updated to reflect the use of gender neutral pronouns, they, them, and their as singular pronouns as well. So for folks who are really grammar sticklers, I relieve you of that responsibility to carry that torch. It is actually no longer a torch to carry. It is something that's accepted by Oxford, by Merriam-Webster, and so on. And in addition, and most importantly, these pronouns are the correct pronouns to use for somebody if they tell you that these are their pronouns, period, right? That's it. There's no debating about people's pronouns. Imagine what it would feel like if somebody consistently argued with you about your pronouns and whether or not they were correct and what pronouns you should be using instead. And really, you should look at a dictionary and so on. It would start to feel really invalidating, really disrespectful for sure, possibly harassing, and even to the point of being pretty violent. And when we think of the word violent, we think of maybe physical violence, but the violence of not reflecting a person's actual name and pronouns to them on a regular basis intentionally or unintentionally, is harmful. There's a cumulative harm that happens for people who experience this on a regular basis. And becoming mindful of that and taking on the responsibility to do the work yourself to better be able to tackle this is what's really important. So with that being said, we're actually going to do that right now. We're going to practice with pronouns. And in the future, if you want to check this out, practicewithpronouns.com, which I did not create, and I am not paid to endorse it. It's just a really good resource, is a good place to do some of this work in the future. But right now, what I'm going to actually have you do is I'm going to have some very brave person. I'm going to unmute you, and I'm going to give you a chance to try to fill in the blanks on a set of sentences with a new set of pronouns. So by a show of hands, who is willing to help us out with this exercise? Anybody? Essentially, you're going to tell us about Rory, who works as a paralegal at a local legal aid organization, and you're going to plug in the pronouns they, them, their, theirs, or themselves where it's appropriate. Who's willing to do it? Can someone raise their hand? Jessica, brave soul. All right, hold on. I'm coming to you. Just a second. All right. All right, Jessica, try talking. Can I hear you?
Can you hear me?
I can. All right, give it a try.
Rory works as a paralegal at the local legal aid organization. They love their job. Clients love them too because of their great attitude. It's hard sometimes when clients and coworkers get their pronouns wrong because it makes them feel misunderstood. But they work with their managers to come up with solutions like getting everyone to add pronouns to their email signature and wear pronoun pins to work, and even offering free pronoun pins for clients to wear too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. You did such a great job.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to mute you again. Fabulous job. Thank you for being the brave first volunteer. I appreciate it. All right, so let's see if we can get back here. All right, so I'm going to ask for another volunteer to take on our second one. Who would like to give it a try? Anybody want to raise their hand? Let's talk about Tim. Full disclosure, I always use examples from my own experience in life. And I, in addition to everything else, I'm a sheep farmer out here in upstate New York. So this is based on that experience as well. So Whitney, I think I saw your hand was raised. Did you unraise your hand? Oh no. All right, hold on. Trying to get to you. Oh, you don't have audio. Okay. Is somebody else able to do it? Raise your hand. We only have 20 minutes left and we got a lot to do. So I'd love a volunteer who's willing to give it a try. All right. I'm going to try it again, Whitney. Here we go. Can we hear you?
Oh. Okay. Can you hear me?
I can. Go for it.
Oh, I do have audio.
All right.
Okay.
Give it a try.
Okay. Tim works on a sheep farm on the weekends for extra cash. Z helps clean out the barn and feeds the sheep hay. Z loves taking care of the little lambs the most and wishes here could adopt a few for herself.
So herself is right, but it would just be Z for that one.
Z, okay, wishes Z could adopt a few for herself, but eventually lambs grow up and Tim doesn't think that housemates, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Or their neighbors would appreciate having full-grown sheep in their tiny backyard.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Whitney. I really appreciate you stepping up. Awesome. All right. And let's see. All right, we have one more. Is anybody willing to try? Last one. And remember, it's okay to make mistakes, right? This is how we practice. And your willingness to stretch yourself and try something new is how you build the muscle memory to do it in the future, even if you make mistakes. Anybody? All right. Well, I'll go ahead and do this one for the sake of time. We'll keep things moving. So this one, we're using the Spivak pronouns, so a, m, er, airs, and m-self. So Jasmine loves dyeing air hair, different colors. Some days A wears it pink, other days blue, and still other days air hair is bright orange. The color changes with air mood, or with the weather, or just for fun. A feels like air hair color is a great way to express himself to the world and have fun doing it. All right. So just remember, if you want to continue practicing, you know, give it, oh, no, sorry. I don't want to get rid of Whitney. I'm trying to switch back to my video here. Let me see if I can do that. Not sure how. All right. If you want to keep practicing, check out practicewithpronouns.com. And instead of binge watching Netflix tonight, you can give that a try. And that's a really great way to practice if you're really struggling with someone's pronouns. Another place you could do it is practicing with yourself in the mirror, practicing with a friend, practicing with your pet. The one person you don't particularly want to practice with is the person for whom you are struggling with their pronouns, right? Do the work. And if you do struggle and you make a mistake when talking about someone, you know, apologize once, correct yourself, and move on. And then do the work when you get home to keep on practicing. Good job. Thanks, everybody, for jumping in. So let's keep going. So just to give a little bit of context about trans people, because I think that, you know, it's all well and good to give you some terms and concepts to understand what, you know, how to describe or talk about trans people and their experiences, but I think it's really important to give it context in today's society and in today's world. When we think about trans people in the media, we often hear about them in terms of military bans. That's the most common thing nowadays. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the media over the past, I don't know, 3 or so years, there's been a constant back and forth swing about whether or not trans people can serve as active military members in the US military. And that seems to change depending on the season. And also, of course, trans people in restrooms, which I have to say, from an advocate's perspective, and also as a trans person myself doing this work, I very much look forward to a day that we can talk about trans people without talking about restrooms and toilets. That will be a beautiful day, and I very much look forward to it, but we're not at that day yet. We are still at a day where this is something that really bothers a lot of people, and specifically the media. And it is a point that politicians across the country have used as a flashpoint, as a hot button point to fuel their political campaigns and their political pursuits that actually have very no basis in reality whatsoever. You know, we had the law in North Carolina that specifically said that people had to use restrooms that were in alignment with their birth certificates, right? So if for example, I, as somebody who was born in Texas and have not been able to change my birth certificate for reasons I'll explain in a moment, I would technically legally not be able to use the men's restroom in North Carolina because it would be against the law, as my birth certificate reflects a female gender marker, right? That thing that some doctor noticed at my birth. But of course, if I walked into a women's restroom in North Carolina, being somebody with a beard and a deep voice, it would probably not go well for me either, right? The point of this law, though, is not to necessarily make it hard for people who, you know, align with our sense of binary standards in this world. So as somebody who passes as a man in this world, specifically a white man with a beard and a law degree, I carry with me a lot of privilege, right? So when I walk into a men's restroom in North Carolina, nobody's going to care at all about me, right? That's not what the law was actually written for. They don't care in any way about my birth certificate. What they care about are criminalizing people who do not live up to our gender expectations and our expectations around sex and sex stereotypes, right? So what they're criminalizing there are people who are gender nonconforming, people who don't have passing privilege, which means that they're somebody who might be identified or perceived to be transgender when walking around in the world. And this can be because of lack of access to medical transition, such as hormones or surgery. It could also have a lot to do with economics and lack of resources to access clothes or makeup or medical treatment that would bring their gender expression into alignment with their gender identity. It could also just be because there are a lot of people who don't identify in a gender binary way and who also need to use restrooms, right? So North Carolina's attempt to criminalize that actually became law and eventually got reversed. In Tennessee, there was a bill that was proposed that specifically said that you had to use restrooms in accordance to your chromosomes, which I don't know how many of you have had your chromosomes checked, but very few people do. Again, it's not about actually caring about chromosomes, right? There's nobody standing outside of doors at public restrooms in Tennessee doing blood tests to check your chromosomes to make sure you're going to the right one. And if they did care about that, they would also create a lot of restrooms for intersex people whose chromosomes may not be, traditionally XX or XY. And that's not what Tennessee cares about. Tennessee cares about, again, criminalizing people who are gender nonconforming in this way that really is a flash in the pan point of fear for people who don't understand trans people and think that we are fake in some way or sneaking into places to cause violence or to cause harm to others, which is just not true. Finally, the last example I'll give before we move on is the bill that came out, I believe it was in Florida, that was similar with the birth certificate requirement, but in addition, there was a bounty. So people could actually get paid by police departments for turning trans people into the police who were using the wrong restroom. Again, this did not become law, but the fact that these bills are popping up everywhere and that these are sort of the predominant messages in the media when we hear about trans people. If you Google trans people, you will hear about restrooms, you will hear about the military, and you'll hear about trans women dying and being killed. And all of these things are true. These challenges are true. These things that we're struggling with are true. But it really has a very harmful impact of reducing the idea about what it means to be a trans person to these very few things, which is actually very harmful. To understand trans people, you have to think about a lot of other pieces of it too. So one thing to consider is access to accurate IDs. In the most recent study, national study of trans people, was over 27,000 trans people responded to the study in 2015. It found that 9 out of 10 trans people are actually walking around with mismatching government issued IDs, right? So that means that among their IDs, their social security cards, their driver's licenses, birth certificates, passports, things like that, among those, 9 out of 10 trans people have mismatching IDs. And why? Is it on purpose? Usually not. Usually it's because somebody was born in a state or lives in a state that makes it incredibly difficult or impossible to update your ID to match who you are accurately. Just imagine that. Imagine right now if in your purse or your wallet or in your bag or wherever it is you keep your identity documents, that right now you had a handful of mismatching documents. And so that anywhere you went, you were never quite sure which one you were going to have to pull out and how that was going to impact your experience navigating that situation. Maybe it's purchasing something that requires proof of ID. Maybe it's traveling on an airplane and going through TSA. Maybe it's being pulled over by a police officer for something unrelated like speeding, but having the wrong gender marker on your ID and that outing you as a trans person to them. Maybe it's applying for a job or applying for school or trying to get medical treatment and the gender marker on your insurance is different than what it is on your other documents, right? So I mentioned before that I have a Texas birth certificate that's incorrect. My Texas birth certificate shows the wrong name, the wrong gender marker. For all practical purposes, if I presented it, it looks like I either stole it from somebody or maybe it belongs to my sister mistakenly. I don't have a sister, right? But by having to show proof of citizenship, proof of date of birth, that is the only thing that I have most of the time. And so I constantly have to out myself to the DMV, to anybody else, a future employer, as a trans person because of that. And the reason is Texas requires that I have a sex change court order in order to change my birth certificate. And to satisfy Texas, that sex change court order needs to show that essentially I am sterile and that I am infertile. They want to know that I am no longer considered female enough to be considered male in terms of changing my birth certificate, which from a reproductive justice standpoint is super problematic, thinking that trans people need to be sterilized or infertile in order to be considered their accurate gender. So thinking of it from that perspective is really horrific. But just recognizing that just this piece of it, being able to access the name change process, which is onerous and expensive and very complicated for a lot of trans people, so it becomes something hard to do, and then being able to access any medical treatment enough to get the IDs that you need is huge. Speaking of medical treatment, thinking about the kinds of treatment trans people might need or want, the first thing to note is that not every trans person wants or needs to go through a medical transition in order to be a transgender person. It is not a requirement and it is not a gold standard. So if you know somebody who's trans and they have not and do not plan to go through any sort of hormonal or surgical treatment or intervention, it does not make them any less a trans person or any less the gender identity that they identify with. Okay, it's very important. For people who do need hormone treatment or surgical intervention as part of their gender transition, it is not always accessible. Either their health insurance will exclude it. This was part of boilerplate language in most insurance policies for the past 3 decades. And so if you have not looked at your insurance policy recently, there's a very strong chance, unless somebody has intentionally worked to take it out, that there is a categorical exclusion in your insurance policy for what they would probably call sex change or sex reassignment or sex transformation, right? And even if you also have a policy on the books to cover that, I bet you money that the exclusion is still there because people copy and paste those things and never look at it. So depending on where you live in this country, depending on what kind of insurance you have through your employer or through the marketplace or through your Medicaid program in your state or Medicare, really determines whether or not you can access treatment that would be covered. It also means that you need to find providers who are competent and qualified in network to be able to do it, which is not always the case. And even then, you also need to have a certain amount of financial privilege to know that you'll be able to go back to your job when it's all over and that you'll have enough money to support yourself while you're out of work recovering from those procedures, right? Aside from transition-related care, there's also the issue of regular care, like other care, right? Getting antibiotics for strep throat, or getting x-rays for a fractured or broken bone, getting treatment for a heart attack, right? Things that are pretty run-of-the-mill that any person, cisgender or transgender, might need, but being told when you arrive at the urgent care center or the emergency room that, oh, well, we don't actually know how to treat transgender people here, we're sorry. Or being given a hard time because your gender identity does not reflect what's on your insurance card or what's on your ID, or just being refused treatment outright and being told that we don't treat trans people here. These are all real life situations that people have to navigate and experience. And in addition to that, being able to access equitable employment. Trans people are disproportionately unemployed and underemployed. Being able to access education, housing, places of public accommodation. Does anybody know what a place of public accommodation is? I'm going to give you, let's see. I'm actually going to send a poll out right now. What I'd like you to do is to check any and all that apply. What are examples of places of public accommodation in this poll? All right. So a lot of you are responding. All of them, right? They're all places of public accommodations, hospitals, emergency rooms, grocery stores, movie theaters, ice cream parlors, basically where life happens in public, right? Anywhere life happens in public is a place of public accommodation. And being able to just access life in public outside of the place where you live, if you have a place to live, and being able to do so without fear of threat or harm or being kicked out or being ridiculed because of who you are is a challenge for a lot of trans people. So thank you for participating in that poll. Very good job, everyone. Um, places that are historically sex segregated, like homeless shelters or domestic violence shelters or substance abuse treatment centers. Considering access, disability access and disability justice, language access issues. These things pile on one another when we're talking about trans people. Being able to access equitable immigration routes, to being able to get asylum or refugee status in this country, or being able to seek citizenship. There are egregious reports of trans people and LGBTQ people being treated with gross degrees of inhumanity and inhumaneness in the immigration detention centers in the southern border of the US right now, as well as other places. But even in our own country, we've made it extremely difficult for people who would be persecuted and possibly killed if they returned to their home countries. We also have issues around family law and trans people being treated fairly in custody issues with their own children, or as children, as transgender children who are in the middle of a custody battle. We have issues around reproductive justice, as I just mentioned, among many others. We also have an aging trans population. For the very first time in our history, we have a lot of older trans people who are going to need access to nursing homes and assisted living and home health aides who will treat them respectfully and not abuse or neglect them. Access to leadership opportunities, and also dealing with over police harassment and incarceration and police profiling. All of these things, just navigating day-to-day basis as a trans person is exceptionally difficult and challenging. And recognizing that when you're working with a trans person, either as a client or a customer or as an employee or colleague, these things are all working together to influence their experience. In addition to that, just being able to navigate as an individual trans person, a variety of different institutions that are working together to make your life incredibly difficult, and also that change on such a regular basis without your control or input. The psychological associations and institution really acts as a gatekeeper for being able to access transition-related care. Access to that care through medicine, through hormones or surgery, as we already said, is challenging. And your ability to do so is really dependent on where you live based on the laws of your state or your locality, and also the political landscape at the time, right, which swings pretty wildly on a year-to-year basis. Taking also into consideration the framework of intersectionality, right, which is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to help us account for the ways that our different identities directly inform and dictate our experience in a world that systematically values some kinds of people over others and gives benefits to some people at the expense of others in a structural, institutional, and interpersonal way, right? So it is no surprise in terms of, when we think of it in terms of intersectionality, that trans women of color who are poor and or disabled are experiencing grossly disproportionate amounts of discrimination, harassment, and violence compared to individuals like myself who are trans masculine, white, and credentialed, right? And with no visible disabilities. So our experiences are vary from person to person and community to community, but recognizing how all these things work together to make our lives challenging is important. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. What I'd like to do is very quickly give you a pop quiz to make sure you were all paying attention. So we're gonna run through these quickly. Here we go. These are true, false questions. First one, true or false, you can accurately assume a person's gender by their physical appearance or voice. True or false? You can accurately assume a person's gender by their physical appearance or voice. All trans people are also lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It's LGBTQ after all. You can only use a person's legal name when talking to them or about them. If a person's preferred name is not their legal name, you must find out what their real name is. Oh, that one's a little problematic, isn't it? The problem here is the word real name. What is a real name anyway, right? So when we're thinking about if a person's preferred name is not the same as their legal name, finding out if you need to, and strictly only for professional purposes, what it is that their legal name is, if you really need to know, is important. And how can we ask that question? When we ask someone, think about the circumstance here, right? So somebody says, oh, my name is Milo. It's the name that I go by. I'd really prefer that you call me that name. And you say, sure, absolutely. I will definitely call you your preferred name, but what's your real name, right? The implication of real is really problematic. If you mess up a person's pronoun, it's best to apologize once and move on. You're right. It's true. Very good job, everyone. With only the very best intentions, it's okay to tell a person that they might look more like a man or a woman if only they blank. You all resoundingly said false. I'm so glad to see that. Yes, definitely false. Don't do that. We're not gender police and we don't give solicited or unsolicited gender advice. And then finally, it is okay to ask a trans person invasive questions about their bodies and relationships. False. If you are a service provider of some kind who needs to know this information specifically to help somebody navigate a healthcare system or a legal system, and you need to know this information, it's always absolutely essential to provide that context and not just ask people questions about their bodies. It is incredible how entitled strangers on the street feel about asking trans people about their bodies. So thank you all for responding to the poll. Just to remember, this was a great opportunity to set a foundation for us so that we all have a common sense of some terms and concepts moving into the next webinar next Wednesday on managing trans employees. And then we'll move from there into sort of organizational big picture look at what are some good talking points that you can make to get your organizations to increase the bottom line by being LGBTQ affirming and welcoming. You've all been fantastic. Thank you for your participation today. And I hope to see you next week. Take care.